Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we speak to Nick Robertson, CNN's international diplomatic editor and one of the most experienced war correspondents in the field today. More than 2 years after the war in Gaza began, a fragile ceasefire is now in place. Full-scale fighting has paused, but the region remains tense, with sporadic cross-border fire, ongoing hostage exchanges and deep uncertainty over Gaza's political future. Who will govern Gaza and how will security be maintained? What real leverage exists to turn a temporary truce into lasting diplomacy? And how does a veteran war correspondent make sense of a conflict still far from resolved? Mr. Robertson, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, you are a veteran journalist, someone who's covered wars around the world for more than 3 decades. Gaza, as we know, is the deadliest place on earth for journalists, and foreign media are still barred from entering independently. Frankly speaking, is Gaza the most dangerous and restrictive environment that you have ever reported from?
It is. And I think, as with all the journalist casualties we see around the world, in whichever conflict, almost invariably, they are the local journalists. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza again. It's the local journalists who are paying the highest price to try to bring the state of the war that's developing and enveloping them and their lives and their families to the rest of the world. And that's something I think all of us who would like to be in Gaza reporting deeply respect. It's the ultimate sacrifice. And in this profession, too many people have to pay that price.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you raise a really important point there. Now, you personally reported from inside Gaza early on in the war. Obviously, since then, Israel has prevented foreign journalists from entering, and more than 180 reporters have been killed there. Now, that is the highest death toll for journalists in any conflict in modern history. Tell me, do you and your colleagues at CNN feel frustrated, even outraged by these ongoing restrictions?
I think back to other wars we've covered that have been dangerous. And I think back perhaps to 1992 to 1995 in Bosnia. And the journalists there were able to get into Sarajevo, a city under siege. The besieging forces wouldn't allow journalists easy access to get in. They controlled the access, but they still allowed journalists to get through the front lines. It wasn't an easy process, but and that was a situation fraught with danger, perhaps not the same dangers that exist in Gaza. The hotel there, for example, that journalists stayed in was literally on the front line. And I remember waking up one morning with mortar rounds being fired out from near the hotel, return tank fire towards the hotel, machine gun fire from the tanks firing literally into the inside of the hotel through the holes that have been pounded. And it was a very, very difficult conflict to cover. It was a very difficult conflict, if you will, from a journalist perspective, to get the world to care about. But Gaza is absolutely beyond that, in the realm that we can't get there, that we're not permitted either from crossing from Egypt or crossing from Israel, and that's a frustration because to be there, you feel that you can tell the story and bring the voices from the story. And those voices are not extinguished because local journalists do have access. But it's a restriction that I think limits the world's understanding and scale of what is happening.
And it is such a powerful story to tell. Now, you've reported from some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. You mentioned they're even really facing direct gunfire at the front of the building, and yet you were still allowed to do your job. So tell me, when we look at Gaza today, do you see this approach as Israel deliberately targeting journalists on the ground or showing complete disregard for their lives? And should Israel face greater accountability for that?
Well, Israel has named some of the journalists, or said that some of the journalists that it's killed belong to Hamas. The proof of that hasn't been put in a public forum for complete scrutiny. And part of the scrutiny that a journalist like me would want to, want to probe those kind of allegations is to be there on the ground and talk to people on the ground. So Israel's allegations, are hard to prove or disprove. Certainly, many of the journalists, friends, other journalists, of those journalists who've been killed would dispute what Israel has said. And there certainly does appear to be situations where groups of journalists have gone in, and there have been cases, or at least one case that springs to mind over the past month or so, where a group of journalists went to report on one strike, and then Israel had a follow-on strike. This is not uncommon in war to have follow-on strikes, but the result of it was very clear that the journalists and recovery workers who'd gone there in the immediate aftermath of the first strike were again targeted. Look, we're seeing this also in the Ukraine conflict. Russia is now putting drones up over areas where rescue and recovery workers and local reporters are going into the scene of strikes. The drones there have the effect of denying Ukrainian rescue and recovery workers of doing their job, of restoring power, and all these sorts of critical functions. So again, these types of sort of second strikes are not uncommon in war, but it's increasingly the case that journalists will be caught up in those strikes. But I think when it comes to the allegations that journalists that Israel has made, that journalists were members of proscribed organizations like Hamas, is a very frustrating one for journalists stuck on the outside who would like to, do due diligence, and follow up on those allegations, and report the findings. That's a frustration. If Israel makes those allegations, then perhaps it could provide the ability for reporters to test their claims, and that's just not possible right now.
Oh, look, you're being very diplomatic there at the moment as well, but it is the complete lack of transparency that is a major concern. And as we know, under international humanitarian law, journalists should be protected and allowed access to conflict zones. That is a basic principle. Now, Craig McIver, a former UN human rights official who we've interviewed on this program, told Al Jazeera last year that Western media had become part of the mechanism of genocide by repeating Israeli official narratives and downplaying Palestinian suffering. Tell me, you have covered this war right from the start. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think we're doing a huge amount to report on the suffering of Palestinians. We have teams in Gaza who are reporting for us, who we liaise with daily, hourly, and who help us get that frontline reporting that we can't do ourselves. And they're hugely courageous and do a tremendous job of bringing the absolute despair and destruction that's going on in Gaza. I can think of the case recently where I was sitting in Israel reporting on the death through starvation of a young child. Israel disputes that the child died of starvation, disputes the narrative that comes from Gaza, says that it's, this is all sort of Hamas propaganda. But I found that incredibly challenging to report on. It was hugely difficult, to see the images and to tell that story because it's emotionally hard, and you can only begin to imagine what it's like for those families inside of Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. I think the stories that have come out have been harrowing. And on the flip side, it's also horrific that for so many of the local journalists inside, simply reporting the news carries what can be a death sentence. Now, a couple of months ago in August, you wrote a great piece of CNN talking about the hopes of Palestinian state. You said these hopes are still quite far off. Now that we're here today, at the end of October, with a ceasefire in place, the success of the Saudi-French diplomatic push, do you think that shifts the political landscape at all, or are we still just as far from statehood as ever?
What everyone's spoken about recently is momentum. And there is a sense that there is more momentum in the process and that it's in a more positive place than it has been recently. And a lot of people would credit President Trump for bringing that about, and he's got his diplomats in Israel this week in strong part to continue to make sure that the ceasefire and those aspirations still hold. But I think when you look at the peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh that President Trump visited, it was really noticeable that some of the key big players in the region, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, wasn't present. Saudi Arabia's very able, very capable foreign minister was there. I mean, and an incredibly astute diplomat. But when the Crown Prince doesn't attend, and we saw similarly from the UAE, MBZ didn't attend either, it really tends to convey a message that while this is a moment of momentum, that this is a moment of optimism, there's still a huge degree of skepticism whether or not President Trump's plan can be realized. We hear increasing delays in the possibility of this sort of international stabilization force. It's gone from being perhaps weeks away now to being perhaps months away. And I think these types of developments as they emerge now really strain the possibilities of what can be achieved. They don't make it impossible. But I think what we're seeing from leaders in the region is a degree of hesitancy around this plan. I was speaking with a diplomat whose country was one of those 8 in New York who met with President Trump. I was speaking with him last night, and he was not particularly hopeful about the possibility of of the ceasefire holding, and I think that's a considered opinion among many parties to this.
Well, there clearly is a lot of pressure on making this ceasefire work. There is a lot of hope around it. I'd actually push back a little bit about your point about Saudi Arabia not taking the talks seriously. Their role, frankly, has been key in getting us here. But there are big questions that still remain over Hamas demilitarizing and, of course, who governs Gaza the day after. Now, Israel's right-wing government has repeatedly rejected the idea of a Palestinian state. We've heard sharp criticism from Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff as well, who've said, frankly, they were stunned by Israel's strike in Doha during the hostage talks. They called it a move that blew up the negotiations. Do you think that there is any force in the world that can actually influence Mr. Netanyahu?
Well, I think we've seen President Trump already influence him. And the question is, how much more does President Trump want to lean on the scales, the political scales in Israel, and perhaps, tip a balance that goes against the favor that Prime Minister Netanyahu's right-wing coalition have at the moment within that government? And that's a very, very open question. I don't think anyone has the answer to that. Prime Minister Netanyahu is an incredibly skilled and deft politician with decades of experience under his belt. But he is faced with a huge challenge at the moment. And I think very much what we see coming out of the region is going to be determined by Prime Minister Netanyahu's relationship with President Trump and the amount of influence President Trump wants to bring to bear on the situation. And that Vice President Vance has been in Israel this week, that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to be in Israel. Others have been there, speaks to, efforts to keep this all going.
Mm. And of course, big questions still remain as well about the future of Hamas. They've been at the center of this war for the last couple of years. But as we know, it is ordinary Palestinians who will live with the consequences of whatever comes next. So from your reporting, what do you see as the most realistic endgame for Hamas?
That's a really difficult question to answer. It's an organization that's been around for since the early 80s. I suppose one could say even, would trace its roots back prior to that. Is an organization that has evolved. It's an organization whose leadership has evolved the organization based on what they see around them. At the moment, they are asserting themselves as the security force and presence inside of Gaza. There's certainly a lot of Gazans that absolutely don't want Hamas around, but the groups, the sort of security groups, if you will, that have risen to prominence while Israel has been present and dominant inside of Gaza, are now seeing their authority, are now seeing their writ taken apart by Hamas. So, Hamas clearly has an intent to survive based on its long history and its trajectory of leadership. It is an organization that is unlikely to want to disarm because weapons are a way of enforcing and enabling their authority within the Gaza Strip. I don't see this as an organization that is going to do what is laid out in President Trump's 20-point plan, which is give up a political future and put down their weapons. I see Tony Blair and his learned methodology of dealing with disarmament through the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement of 1998, where it took 7 years to get the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, to disarm, to put down their weapons, put them beyond use. I think that is a methodology that can have some traction, but I don't see, I'm not sure that I see a willingness. I'm not sure that I see Israel giving it that sort of length of time. It's existential for Hamas. It would seem highly improbable that they are going to, having withstood such a heavy military onslaught at such cost around them to the civilian population, that they are really going to move over and hand off. I suppose a best case scenario, realistically, would be to agree to put their weapons down, which there appears to be some speculation that they've made those guarantees to some of the neighboring states. To put those down and move in a political direction only, but to maintain under a different name, perhaps some kind of, police role. But the idea that Hamas would want to allow some international stabilization force to come in, take their weapons away from them and to fill in the tunnels, which is what Israel desires, I find that a very hard stretch.
And I think that is going to be one of the biggest challenges, particularly, again, we look at people like Tony Blair being involved as well, a lot of criticism, how he handled the exit in Iraq as well. So huge challenges. Now, Saudi Arabia has consistently been at the diplomatic table during the midst of this, pushing for a ceasefire, backing Arab League positions, working closely with France and other partners. Now, I know earlier you said you felt they weren't necessarily serious about making these talks a reality. Tell me, what makes you say that, given they have been one of the main nations pushing for a ceasefire and a Palestinian state, not just now, but frankly, for decades?
Yeah. Sorry if I created confusion there. No, I think Saudi Arabia is deeply committed to finding peace in Gaza, 100%. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. What I thought, or I was trying to say, was that I think that Saudi Arabia was reticent to send the Crown Prince to Sharm el-Sheikh when there were so many uncertainties remaining about President Trump's 20-point plan. There will be many reasons that neighboring states, including Saudi Arabia, don't want to be seen to be coming in and providing a security force that's going to enable an Israeli version of what should happen. So I think that's what I'm implying. There's reticence there to put big names at the table at this early stage. What is happening behind the scenes, and Saudi Arabia's commitment and the Crown Prince's very strong political diplomatic message that I think, as we have witnessed over these 2 years of the appalling loss of civilian life in Gaza, that he has become ever stronger and firmer in what he's saying about a two-state solution, a path to a two-state solution, and that's not realized in this 20-point plan. what Saudi Arabia has been discussing with France, with President Macron, undoubtedly will be something that will benefit the situation. And frankly, I'm looking forward to getting more details about it so we can see how it folds in. I am guessing that what has been achieved so far can be worked in along the way as you get an international stabilizing force, which seems to be the sort of big hurdle facing everyone at the moment. Its context, its scale, its scope, its parameters. Does it have a UN mandate? All of those things are going to be absolutely vital into realizing the other pieces. But while Prime Minister Netanyahu says that he and his right-wing coalition oppose a two-state solution, the diplomatic space for Saudi Arabia to reach what it wants and what its partners want, it seems very, very constricted at the moment.
And you're right, there are still a number of gaps of the everyday practicalities of how this plan will work long term. We know phase one of the plan has made some progress, but I think the real sticking point will be in the coming days, weeks, months, as we move into phase two, the disarmament of Hamas and what comes next in terms of governing and rebuilding Gaza. Now, looking beyond Gaza, the entire region remains volatile. How would you assess the risks in Syria, Lebanon and Iran? And where do you see the greatest chance of this conflict spilling over?
Yeah, and there seems to be, particularly from a Saudi context as well, the issue of the Houthis and Yemen, which is, obviously something Saudi Arabia has had to deal with and, is very close to Yemen in many ways and has been supportive over the decades. That the Houthi leadership in Yemen is one of the sort of outstanding tripwires in what's going on at the moment. Their ability to interdict shipping in the Red Sea and their desire or abated desire at the moment while they wait to see how the Gaza how the Gaza ceasefire plays out. That's an issue. I think the terms clearly, we've heard from the Lebanese very recently that the terms of negotiations between Israel and them about Hezbollah are very difficult, are very problematic for Lebanese authorities. I think, Syria again is going to be a contested in as much as Israel's relationship with the new leadership in Syria is something that is still developing. It's hard to say what the biggest potential flashpoint will be. There are so many pieces of this that continue to move, and not least Iran and Iran's willingness to engage with the United States, and therefore how it acts against US allies, Israel, in the region. It doesn't seem that an Iran-US dialogue on its nuclear weapons, nuclear stockpiles is particularly close. They're bridling, obviously, at the pressure that's being put on them by the Trump administration, the economic pressure. There are so, as you rightly question this point, there are so many issues, that could touch, that could still inflame and engulf the region. I suppose if one takes a very, very, very big historical perspective here, are we on the upside or downside of tensions and conflict? And it's hard to judge, but partly because it's not just constrained to the region, partly because you have, powers like the United States and China in greater competition. You have more isolationist United States than you've had before. So there are so many parts of this dynamic. It's very, very hard to predict.
And I think you've touched on a crucial point there. Now, Saudi Arabia sits at the centre of so much of those regional topics, from security to diplomacy. And certainly, while there are major flashpoints with the potential to destabilise the region, on the flip side, there are also actors like Saudi pushing for change and stability. Now, I know you have covered the kingdom for many years now. From your perspective, how transformative are the reforms that are taking place there? And how are you seeing them reshape Saudi's role on the global stage today?
I think they're significant. Certainly, the Crown Prince's desire to see, a block of Gulf states that and regional partners, potentially, including Iran, that are, let's say, not federated, not connected in the same way that the European Union is, but a group of nations that can be more open with each other, that can trade with each other, that he sees the future as one where there are economic benefits to all from fixing historic disputes in the region, it is one that emerges and becomes very clear. And certainly from a defense perspective as well for Saudi Arabia and its regional partners, what we're seeing emerge from conflicts around the world is that from a defense perspective, having a joined up view is in the benefit of all of those within within that defensive umbrella, if you will. I see the developments that the Crown Prince is putting in place in Saudi Arabia. Look, it's the biggest country in the region. It's the most powerful diplomatically. Yes, there are issues that the Crown Prince has to deal with internally, but this is a country that's clearly going to be a rainmaker in the future. And look, just look at the deal that China helped foster between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For many people, that came out of the blue. I don't think it did, obviously, for the Crown Prince, but it does show that he is looking to bring a broader peace to the region and willing to engage with partners outside of the traditional partners like the United States to try to move that along. Everything is by increments. Everything is a step at a time. But that was an important step.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that vision of a more open, economically connected region, even involving Iran, really underscores just how much is at stake at the moment. But tell me, you've spent your career bringing stories like this to the world, but all of us know journalism is changing fast today. Television news is facing dwindling viewership and ratings. There's big competition from social media, streaming, podcasts, and of course, AI. What do you think will keep serious journalism relevant in the years ahead?
I think a serious audience. And I think the two go hand in hand. There is an appetite for good, trustworthy journalism, and that's what we're all about. It's what we strive for every day. And I think if we can keep delivering that, there'll be an audience that wants it. And I suppose one of my takeaway experiences from the last 30 years or so, and it's a shame that this is the experience in a way, but people value news more when it's really important to them. And here I'm thinking of countries in conflict. I was really struck again recently when I was in Pakistan during that 4-day war with India. There was an immense appetite in the region there, both in India and Pakistan, and more broadly in the region, for journalism like ours at CNN that was seen as non-partisan, that we weren't pro-Pakistan or pro-India, because the audience recognized that their local media, and we'll notice that some of the Indian media actually apologized to their audience for being too gung-ho and for sort of taking on the government line, if you will, during that conflict. So absolutely, there is an appetite for what we offer, which is trustworthy, unbiased, unvarnished news reporting, and we stay true to that, and we'll have to continue to stay true to that. How big will the audience be? Sadly, I think they'll come to us when they realize they need us, and that may take a number of people in their tens of millions to stray into the rumor mills and the twisting that's available on everywhere they turn on their social media feeds. But people will trust people who are trustworthy. That's my core belief. And that's never been shaken by this, and I don't believe it will change.
But potentially on different mediums, more online these days. But I do think that's an interesting point. You say good content will always find the right audience. Now, it also depends not just about who's listening, it's also about the people who are shaping the narrative, people like you. You've spent your life on the front lines of war and diplomacy. You've reported from places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and now Gaza. And we've talked about some of it today. But frankly, these are places most people would never even set foot. And I'm sure that kind of work really leaves a mark. How do you personally carry the weight of witnessing so much conflict and be able to keep going back?
I'm incredibly lucky. I have a very, very supportive family. My wife is a journalist, well, was a journalist. We met while at CNN during the build-up to the first Gulf War. Indeed, she came with me to Baghdad when the first Gulf War started. We've seen each other in difficult situations, so she understands the job. She understands me in difficult situations. Our daughters, who are now grown, and one of them's a journalist as well, understand what it is I do, what it is I try to do. And so that being able to go home and just be dad and a husband is incredibly grounding. I like sports, so that I think is a way of sort of relieving some of the stresses that come with this. But for sure, it's left its mark. I mean, when you watch suffering up close and you talk to people who've suffered, who've lost loved ones, I kind of feel that the burden of that is accumulative. Our family jokes that if we're sitting at home watching a movie, I'm the first one to have tears rolling down my cheeks. And I don't think I was like that 20 or 30 years ago. So, yeah, I think it's made me perhaps, I don't know, rawer. I'm not sure the right words to describe it, but yeah, it has an impact.
And tell me, after everything that you have seen and reported on over so many years, which is the story that stayed with you the most and why?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think perhaps the earliest experiences are the ones that are the most vivid. Driving into Bucharest during the overthrow of Ceausescu in the Christmas of 1989, is sort of seared into my memory of the cameraman and producer who I met at the border who were covered in blood, and the truck driver I was with, who was driving me and the equipment in, so I was an engineer back then, refused to go in, and you really have to sort of challenge your own mettle about doing it. So those memories are very vivid. I have particularly vivid memories in Afghanistan during the Taliban's early years in the mid-90s. Just what the utter desperation of families whose villages had been destroyed, mud homes reduced the mud on the floor, and a man with a shovel one October then digging through, looking for the remains of his family's possessions in what was left of his house, and pulling out an old iron bedstead. And for him, that was a victory. And for me, it just told me about the appalling paucity and tragedy that accompanies war the world over. There are some visual memories like that are absolutely seared into my mind that I will never forget, and they're very powerful, and they speak to so many of the conflicts that I've covered.
Wow, well, they are extraordinary stories. And I will say, I think we're all very grateful to you for bringing them to the world, particularly from places like Gaza, where access remains so restricted. Mr. Robertson, it has been a real pleasure having you on Frankly Speaking today. We do appreciate your time, and we hope to be able to see journalists eventually allowed back into Gaza to be able to tell those stories on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you too.